So recently BougeRV sent out this little cooler freezer for me to try out and test. In exchange, I told them I kind of run this thing through the paces, get an idea for what it kind of is capable of doing, and then I'm going to do my best to kind of relay that to you so you can make a decision as to whether this might be something that you'd want to consider for you and your situation. So with that being said, this is model number CR22. It's a 23 quart freezer, which you can also pick up one size bigger and get a 30 quart if you decide that's something you would like to look at. They've also got this thing available in 5 different colors. So I've got the black one here in front of me, but you can also pick this thing up in gray, green, pink, and purple. So if one of those colors kind of stands out to you a little bit more, take a look at that. And then one other option you can get this thing with as well, which I don't have here with me, is a fridge cover. So essentially if you live in a hotter climate or if you're battling hot temperatures during the summer, you could run that little freezer cover over the top of this thing, and that's going to help with the efficiency of keeping this thing cooled down where you want it to be throughout the day without overworking the freezer. So with that being said, let's go and dive into some of the features on this thing and what I found after using it for about a week and see if we can figure out if this is the right thing for you or not. So first thing, when I got this out of the box, I wanted to go ahead and take it out to my wife's SUV. We have a Tahoe, and that's what we predominantly use for all of our running around, whether it be kids sporting events or farmers markets we do, things of that nature. It's nice having something we can keep drinks cold with, and with us being a family of 4, we can really pack this thing full for the day and pretty much live out of this thing until we get back home that evening. The first thing I noticed when I got this out to my wife's truck was because the Tahoe has such a narrow space back there with the 3rd row being up, I don't have a lot of room to work with. This unit is basically perfect for that space back there, which is a huge surprise to me and also a huge bonus. I've got a couple of these little cooler freezers that I've been using for quite some time, and they both are extremely large compared to this one, and I have to put those 3rd rows down. They're handy on weekend trips, but like as I mentioned, I can't take a lot of people with me if I've got those seats down at the same time. So this is gonna be a nice cooler to take with me if we're just gonna be gone for the day, or even maybe a small trip over the weekend. It just takes up a lot less space. And why that might be advantageous to you is if you're, say, like maybe an over-the-road truck driver or a delivery driver, something of that nature, and if you're just going maybe on a camping trip and you want to take a couple dozen drinks with you, you can throw those in here extremely easy. This cooler will still be at a very manageable weight for you to carry around. So huge plus on the size while still being able to maintain a decent amount of space inside here, depending on what it is you decide you want to bring with you. Now let's go and talk about power consumption for a second here. That was something else I was curious about, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be a huge power draw on whatever power source I put this thing on. So there's 2 different ways you can plug this thing in. You've got a 12-volt cord like you see here, got a 90-degree cord on it, which I thought was nice. So that's one more way to save a little bit of space, especially when space matters, like in the back of my wife's SUV. You can also plug this thing into a 110 cord as well. So I've got your normal receptacle cord here at the same time. So you can just as easily plug this thing into the house too. Now when it comes to power consumption, there's 2 different modes you can run this thing in. It's got a max mode and it's got an eco mode. Now it's advertised as being 36 watts of power consumption on the eco mode and 45 watts on the max mode. Not a huge difference in those numbers, but if you were using something like, let's say, this power station and maybe you're out on the campground, that could make the difference of several hours, depending on how demanding your freezer is being that day and how hot the temperatures are. So the first thing I did when I plugged this into my wife's Tahoe is I wanted to see exactly how long it took the freezer to get down to temperature. Now when it came to default when I first plugged it in, I was running in the max mode, and then there's a battery protection as well, which we'll talk about here in just a second, and it was running in the high mode. I very quickly got an error code on the screen saying E1. I had to look that up in the manual to see what that actually meant, and basically all that was there wasn't enough voltage being registered to actually run the unit, so it kind of put itself into protect mode and wouldn't allow itself to run. So I went ahead and switched it over to the eco mode, and then I knocked that battery protection down to the medium. Let's talk about that battery protection for a second, because that was something I had to read up on. I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. So basically it's going to read the cut in and cut out voltage that your vehicle or whatever your power source is going to run off of. So if you're in a vehicle or some kind of a 12-volt source like this power station, even something like that, you're going to want to run that battery protection in the low or the medium range. Whereas if you're plugging it into the wall, obviously you'll have plenty of juice. You can run that in the high all day long. So I'll put a graph on the screen to show you what those cut in and cut out voltages are, so you kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. Because something to keep in mind too is if your vehicle's sitting there and it's not running, you're usually going to be somewhere between 11.8 volts and maybe like 12.4 volts. Whereas if the vehicle's running, you're running at 14.4. And it's constantly charging. Depending on whether you're running down the road or you're sitting there idle, might make a difference as well as to what battery protection mode you put that into. And then when it came to cooling this thing down, like I mentioned a second ago, the ambient temperature in this cooler when I first got it outside was about 70 degrees. I got it cooled down to about 30 degrees in less than 30 minutes. So it does a really good job of getting down to temperature. Now I did mention already too that this thing can be used as a freezer at the same time. So I noticed on the screen when I was trying to knock it down, it can go down to -8 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a pretty good range to keep something frozen. And obviously you only need to keep it under 32 degrees to keep it frozen. So depending on where you want that thing to be at, you can bump that number up just a touch so the freezer doesn't have to work as hard and still be able to keep those items frozen for quite some time. So the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to look at the power consumption numbers and see if they were being advertised the same as what I'm actually seeing on my screen here. So I hooked them up to a little power station and ran it through several different settings as well as in 12 volt and 110 just to see what kind of numbers I was getting. And I can tell you that what they advertise is pretty much spot on to what I was seeing on my power station. So it didn't really matter whether I ran it in the 110 or in the 12 volt. Basically, the power consumption numbers were pretty much right on that 36 to 45 range, depending on whether I was running it Eco or Max. So there wasn't really a lot of variance there. The only real difference I did see was on the screen of the actual cooler. When I was running it off of the 12 volt cord, I was running 12 volts. When I ran it off of the 110 cord, I was seeing around 14.5 volts on the screen. But the power consumption numbers were pretty much spot on. It didn't really matter which cord I was running. So that's kind of the gist on the features of this thing and how this thing operates. Like I said, I've only had this thing for about a week. I've only had the opportunity to use it just a couple times, but I have put a few hours on it just running it. I wanted to get a sense for how loud this thing was, which by the way, let's turn this thing on so you can hear what it sounds like when it's running. So you hold the power button down for 3 seconds. That turns the unit on. And then after just a couple seconds here, you'll hear the compressor kick on. So I'll be quiet for just a second so you can hear that. It's not too loud, you can still talk over it. In fact, if you've got this thing in the trunk, you're not gonna hear it at all. And if you've got it in an SUV in the back section, you might be able to faintly hear it run, but in all honesty, the road noise is probably gonna overtake the sound of this little cooler anyways. The last thing we can kind of go over real quick is the buttons on the top of this thing. So I've already mentioned the power button here, but it does have a settings button, which that's how you're gonna change it from Max and Eco mode, as well as switch it between the battery protection modes as well. And then your plus and minus there are going to operate your up and down for your temperature settings. Now something else to keep in mind too is after this unit's been running for a minute, it'll go into a locked mode. So basically, which it just beeps. So that means it's now in the locked mode. So I can't actually push these buttons and do anything until I hold down the settings button for 3 seconds. That lock will go away, and then I can change the settings, turn the unit off, whatever it is I need to do. So overall, I'm extremely impressed with this cooler so far. I think it's gonna be a great addition, especially during the spring and summer months for us when we're on the go all the time. I'll be able to pretty much just kind of keep this thing in my wife's truck full time. We can just kind of load it out with drinks, sandwiches, whatever it is we need for that day. And man, it just sure is way better than having to carry a bag of ice with you or go to the gas station making multiple trips to kind of keep things cold. Hopefully I did this little cooler some justice and now you guys can make a decision as to whether this might be worth the investment for you guys or not. Other than that, I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch. We'll catch you guys on the next one.